delighted to welcome you and our speakers here today for this really important conversation. Demos is working to reinvent democracy, to connect people and policymakers and politicians to create a more collaborative democracy for the future. And that feels like a very urgent and important challenge, particularly at the moment. This event is part of our Collaborative Democracy Network, which convenes people about every month or two to talk about the big issues where people can contribute more to how democracy is working. And today is about net zero. And net zero is a really stark kind of illustration of where people, government, business, civil society, everyone is going to have to come together to deliver really big change. And to achieve that, government is going to have to change how it works to encourage that and provide the platform for everyone to play their part. So we're really excited to be talking about that today, to welcome you all here and to welcome our speakers. And my job is just to hand over to my colleague Miriam. Thank you.
Yeah, as Polly said, just the hugest welcome to tonight. I hope everybody's got a seat. There are more seats here at the front if you want to kind of come and sit down, if that's more comfortable for you. And welcome to everybody who's joining online. I think we've got well over 100 people joining online tonight as well, which is fantastic. So yeah, as Polly said, this is the first of our Collaborative Democracy Network events of 2025. For those of you who are new to our event series, this network was set up to bring politicians, civil servants, civil society together to look at how we can do democracy differently for people, how we can really make it work for them so democracy feels like something that is actually working in a way that it's not really working for them at the moment. We know that trust in politics and political institutions and politicians is falling off the edge of a cliff, and that populism is on the rise. So it feels like a really good moment to be taking stock and thinking, okay, how can we do democracy differently so people have another alternative as opposed to going down a populist route? One of the ways that we can think to counter this trend of kind of a move towards populism is looking for opportunities for people to get more involved in democracy so it can work better for them. Which is why it's really, really good tonight that we actually got this event tonight looking at net zero, and I'm joined by some fantastic speakers because what we're going to be doing is talking about how the public can be involved in that transition to net zero. And the context for that is that the government is going to be publishing its public participation strategy to meet net zero, which is going to be setting out how the public can be involved in policy development and how the government can support people kind of through the transition to make the transition and change their own behaviour. And it's really important that we do this because the public has a really, really important role to play in the journey to net zero, both in terms of their actions, but also in consent and support for the changes associated with that transition. We know that most people in the UK are concerned about climate change. We know that people are willing to make changes, sometimes to the detriment of their own lifestyles. They're prepared to make choices that will make their lives a bit harder, potentially a little bit more expensive, not quite as comfortable as they have been. But it is really important to take people on that journey so they understand what this is about, why they have a stake in it, and what's actually going to convince them to make those changes and make them fast as we want to hit net zero. So in order to hear more about the government's public participation strategy and how best to bring the public on the journey, we're going to be hearing from these fantastic speakers that we've got tonight. For a bit of housekeeping, what we're going to be doing is every speaker will have about 5 minutes. And then we're going to open up really quickly to discussion from the floor, because the way these events work really nicely is really to hear from you. We've got an incredible set of people in the room tonight, from civil servants, civil society, lots of people with loads of both knowledge and experience of this world. So we really want to hear from you. We want to hear your reflections on what the speakers have said, and we really want to hear your questions so we can dig deep into what people are saying. But before we get there, let me just introduce the panel. So we've got Kerry McCarthy. Minister McCarthy was appointed Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero in 2024. She's been MP for Bristol East since 2005. Long time, so I've got all my practice. Kerry was Assistant Whip at the Treasury from 2009.
This will take you forever if you go.
Oh, the whole thing. I'll tell you where she went to school. Potted history.
Yeah,
basically held various positions in opposition, including Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Net Zero, Shadow Minister for Transport, and as Shadow Minister for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So obviously got a huge background kind of in this world. Rachel Orr is CEO of Climate Outreach, who help people and organisations tell new climate stories to inspire greater climate action. Rachel joined Climate Outreach from Place Shapers, the national network for community-based housing associations. And previously, Rachel was head of Oxfam's UK programme and held senior roles at Shelter. Matt Scarf is the managing director of BAFTA Albert, which is the leading authority on environmental sustainability in the UK's film and television industry. In his role, Matt develops forward-thinking strategies, optimises digital resources and nurtures strong partnerships across the UK and internationally, expanding Albert's global influence as a pioneer in sustainable production practices. And lastly, we've got Sarah Allen, who's one of the UK's leading specialists in public engagement in decision-making. She has over a decade of experience in designing and delivering innovative public engagement that works both for those taking part and for commissioning bodies. Sarah's led work at UK-wide, devolved, local and hyper-local level, including the Climate Assembly UK, which was set up by 6 select committees of the House of Commons. So with that, I'm going to turn to Kerry, and would you please tell us about the public participation strategy and what you hope to achieve by it?
Okay, thank you. And it's good to be here. I think my starting point would be we know we're under an imperative to act, and upon coming into government last July, I hope that we've demonstrated that we are showing domestic leadership and international leadership. And it's partly a moral imperative. We know that last year was the first year that the 1.5 degrees was exceeded. But it's also a legal imperative because we're now committed in law to getting to net zero, and we have these legally binding carbon budgets that every 5 years or so we have to meet. We also have an ambitious nationally determined contribution that Keir Starmer went to COP in Baku at the end of last year to say that we will reduce emissions by 81% now. So all these things are what's driving us. The thing that's most immediately driving us, though, is hopefully you'll have come across the idea of mission-based government and the clean energy superpower mission, clean power by 2030 and accelerating to net zero. And I always feel that I have to make sure that people remember that across government, across all relevant sectors, accelerating to net zero is very much part of that mission as well. So that's what's driving us. There has been, we were just talking about this before the event started, there's a poster on the wall there that says something about I support the climate consensus. And I think there was a climate consensus apart from a few outliers like Nigel Lawson or Peter Lilly or whatever, but that has broken down quite a bit in recent years. It started with Rishi Sunak doing a bit of a U-turn round about the time of the Dubai COP. But now Kemi Badenoch has come out very clearly. And it's not really climate denial, it's saying, but it's a denial of the need to take action, or the case for taking action now, and very much around that it's like the cost of acting is too great, we can't afford it, etc. And then obviously you've got what is happening with America and Trump pulling out of Paris and so on. So it's become more of a contested space, but if anything, that means that we have to step up action to make sure that we don't allow that narrative to dominate. And we're very keen to get across to people this is a massive economic opportunity for us. We know that economic growth in the sectors that DESNES covers is 10 times higher than elsewhere in the economy. So, and it very much, that just transition is very much part of our growth mission as well. And the polling, and I'm sure we'll get more information on this, but the polling shows that the public is with us as well. But you do always have to bear in mind that people don't always have the luxury of making the right choices because of affordability and accessibility. So it is partly about winning the arguments, but I think it is as much about how you can empower people and make them feel. Sometimes it's about changing things so they don't even notice that they're doing things differently. If you get on an electric bus, that's the same as getting on a diesel bus, but what you want is the bus to turn up, and you've made it very easy for people to have made a greener choice. So there's a whole job of work that the government has to do that. With the public participation strategy, it will be about how you can involve people in that conversation. I'm very keen that we don't sort of go back and rehearse the arguments we've already had about the need to act. It's about how we act and what choices people need to make, but how we empower them to do that as well. As I've said, we very much want to engage. It can't just be the green, the people who probably the people in this room, or thing. It can't just be a message that is got to people through eco-activists or campaign groups or politicians. So we very much want to get that message out through engaging with this is why BAFTA are here, through our work, doing great work. But I've been meeting with the National Theatre, with sports organisations, with the British Fashion Council yesterday. And it's about getting out into people's lives and really, as I said, getting it. Sometimes it's because they're more trusted messengers than politicians are, but it's also about what can the British Fashion Council do to make it easier for people to make sustainable choices. So I think I've said about the sort of strategy. I think we're not just waiting for the strategy to do the engagement. I don't know if people have seen the adverts on television with little knitted characters with the Warm and Fuzzy campaign, which is about heat, and that home decarbonisation is a massive challenge for us. It's not easy to talk to people about heat pumps. It's not the sexiest subject. So, but that is part of efforts to sort of start planting the seed in people's minds that there's choices that they can make there. I think I'll stop on that note, but I am very much in listening mode here today. It's about getting ideas as to how we can roll out this public participation strategy, what we need to do. What we don't need to do, I think, is equally important. What have we banked? And, I was involved in the climate assemblies that happened a few years ago, and I thought they were a really good exercise. But what have we learned from the work that's already been done, and what more do we need to do now? So thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, from your experience at Climate Outreach, can you tell us a bit about the stories that really resonate with people and how you use those stories and those messages to get people to change their behaviour or change their actions?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I learned very early in my career as a campaigner is I think our job as campaigners is to tell people that the thing that we're campaigning on might make their life a bit better or might make the world a bit better. And I think that is such an essential part of what we need to do with our communications on climate. And I find it frustrating that some of the fight that we're currently having, and we are in a fight, is about the term net zero, which, let's face it, is a technocratic term which means nothing to most people. So I think there's a job that we all have to do, people who really, really care about this agenda and know how important it is to protect it, to keep reminding people about the why. We are not doing this because we want to get to net zero. We're doing this because we have to halt runaway climate change, but we're also doing this because we want cleaner air for people to breathe, and we want less kids to have asthma. We want nature that we can all go and enjoy and that can still be enjoyed by our kids and by our grandkids. But I also think it's those stories of the really positive changes that we can make, because I still think too often people's perception of some of the environmental movement, but some of the things that people have to do to tackle climate change is framed around sacrifice. And there are some difficult choices that need to be made by government. There are some choices that we need to talk to people about. But actually more and more, because of the big advances in technology, because of investments that companies are making, that governments are making, those choices are again about kind of making our lives better. Like heat pumps are about making our homes warmer and our bills cheaper. Switching to an electric car will save me money because I'm not putting petrol into my car. So I think we also need to move away from a kind of view of this about being personal sacrifice and actually thinking about raising our heads and saying, like, what are the better lives that we're trying to build today? And kind of collectively, what is that kind of future that we're striving for in the future? And that's hard sometimes. And it's especially hard because, a lot of people find their lives difficult at the moment, and our economy is not moving in the direction that a lot of people would like. So we can't load on choices to people that they're unable to make. But I think there is a huge job about telling people about the really positive benefits that there already are and that there can be in future. I think the other thing that we find a lot and we talk a lot about is people feeling like that there is a sense of like progress and a possibility of this change happening. Because I think when you tell people about the progress that we've already made, you know, when you say to people, you know, did you know that coal used to be 40% of our energy mix and last year we shut down the last coal power station? They're like, what? Really? Like, you know, so I think we have to keep reminding people that we are making progress here. Like, it's not fast enough. There's more we need to do. But if people don't think change is possible, why on earth are they gonna, you know, try and lean in to what we all want to do? And I think the other thing that we hear a lot from people is actually a thirst for more information. And that's why we think the public participation strategy is so essential and so timely, because what we hear time and time again from people is, give me more information. Okay, I might be happy with a solar farm in my community, but I don't really know why you're putting it there, and I don't know what it means for me. So I think there's a big job to do about how do we do kind of earlier, better engagement with people. And I think the final thing that we really, really have to think about doing is the listening piece. You know, I think often as communicators, we think about communicating as the kind of talking and broadcasting element. And how do we think about the message that's right? And how do we think about the messenger that's right? And that is all essential. But actually, what we need to think much more about is how do we listen to people. And a lot of Climate Outreach's work is thinking about what people's personal values are and how you start a conversation or a story about climate from the values people hold dear and kind of build it out rather than starting from the kind of worldview or the policies that we have and kind of bringing people with you. Yeah, I would encourage us to think about how we bring the emotion and the people and the stories of kind of hope and progress as a really important foundation for the storytelling.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. Matt, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of the creative industries kind of in helping people to meet net zero?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me. I'm Matt Scuff, MD of BAFTA Albert. So we're part of BAFTA and we work with the TV and film industry to reduce the carbon footprint of productions in the UK, but actually further afield. And we also have, over the last couple of years, really started to develop our climate content and storytelling business, which is helping producers, commissioners, and storyliners and writers to think about climate content and introducing climate content in a really authentic way, because there's nothing worse than it being crowbarred in and people just thinking what you've done that for, because it's really obvious to spot. So we've got a huge responsibility as an industry and we reach millions of people daily. So that responsibility is very much felt by not only my team, but also the sustainability teams across the industry that we work with, from BBC through to Netflix. I think the thing that we are really keen to make sure we do is to always introduce, I suppose, sustainability and climate change as I said, in an authentic way, but also in a way that people can think this is achievable and manageable. But to your point, Rachel, which is if you terrify everybody, they're not going to engage. But if you actually sort of introduce it in a way that feels palatable, then there's more chance that that is going to stick. And one of the really good, I suppose, experiences that I had when I was at ITV, where I was for about 9 years, was working with some of the teams across Emmerdale and Coronation Street. Daily, continuous dramas they're in everyone's front room. But you can start to plant those seeds and start to plant those ideas and thoughts around climate and sustainability without really having to say anything. So one of the objectives that Emmerdale had, for example, was to include one item or implicit or explicit item around sustainability or climate change. It could be an EV vehicle just passing through shot. It could have been a recharge point. It could have been a solar panel on a roof. But simple things that start to become the everyday. And for me, it sort of resonates with the work I used to do in D&I around inclusion and how do you start to introduce that without it being like a crowbar mechanic. And I think there are a lot of learnings from D&I that I bring to the role at Albert. And I think we're doing an okay job. I mean, I think, we've got people that are engaged. You've got Toxic Town at the moment on Netflix, which is an incredible drama if you haven't seen it. the story and the background around adolescence, which again, if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth watching. It's part of the national conversation. Incredible stuff, and the power of great drama, but the power of great television and film means that I think you can reach so many people so fast with the right message.
Fabulous. Thank you. And Sarah, lastly, can I come to you? How do you think the government could best engage people in meeting net zero?
Ooh, what a question. In 5 minutes. So I'm going to focus my remarks around my specialism, which is public engagement in decision making. So I thought I'd just very briefly say what that is. So when I say public engagement in decision making, I mean engagement that's commissioned by government or others in order to inform that work. So for example, to inform the development, the delivery, the evaluation of strategies, of policies, and of other initiatives. And just very briefly to say that I think why we're interested in those methods in the context of climate change is, for example, and the list isn't exhaustive, is that they make tackling climate change easier, that they can make it cheaper, and also really importantly, we can't achieve a fair transition to net zero without them, and that's because it's not possible to achieve a fair transition without working with particularly affected communities and understanding their experiences, their aspirations, and their needs. So public engagement in decision making then is valuable, but what does it look like? So there are a whole wealth of public engagement in decision making methods, literally hundreds, which I definitely can't go through in the next 5 minutes. So I'm going to briefly outline 3 that I think are relevant to national decision making on net zero. What I would say is that it's really important to pick the right method for the topic and the kind of situation in which you want to engage and who you want to reach. And perhaps we'll come on to some of those questions when we get to the Q&A. So the first method or set of methods that I wanted to talk about are what are known as deliberative mini-publics. So these are things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, citizens' panels. So when I talk about this, people often think of the high-profile national climate assemblies, which I think there have been at least 15 of them in Europe alone now at a national level. But actually, these sorts of processes happen quite often at a kind of lower key level. So, for example, the 2 citizens' panels recently run by the Climate Change Committee to inform their 7th carbon budget. And what they have in common is that they bring together a reflective cross-section of the population, people who might not otherwise participate politically, people with a whole range of different views on climate, and give them the opportunity to learn about the issues that they're going to be looking at, to weigh up what they think about them and potential ways forward, and then to reach a shared conclusion about what should happen. And the reason that those are popular amongst officials and government, and increasingly popular, is it allows government and officials to hear what a group that reflects the population in the way I've just described thinks. So you kind of avoid questions about, am I just hearing the people who shout the loudest? Is that what the general population actually thinks too? It also allows government to hear where those people can find common ground rather than just hearing opposing views. And it allows government and others to hear the informed opinions and judgments of those people once they've understood the realities of the challenges that are facing government. So that's some of the reasons that we hear from governments that they like them. What we see when we look at cases where they've happened in the UK and internationally is that they leave governments also feeling a sort of greater confidence and that they have a greater mandate to take forward different types of climate action, that it becomes easier for them to leverage support from other actors because they're taking action that the public wants, if you like. And that you also end up with better design policies that work better first time round, therefore more likely to gather public support, and that also go with the grain of what's publicly acceptable. And what we're beginning to see in Europe and around the world is that countries are finding these useful, and they're starting to introduce semi-permanent or permanent deliberative mini-publics to advise their governments on an ongoing basis so that it's quicker and easier. So you're not recruiting a new set of people each time. It's quicker and easier for different departments, for different teams to ask people for advice on more of an ongoing basis. It's also possible in some countries these panels choose some of the topics they look at themselves, so it brings to government's attention the areas that the public see as kind of most important and critical to them right now. The second method I wanted to talk about a little bit, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk as long about all of them, is co-creation. So co-creation is a method that brings both stakeholders as well as the public into a room. So you look at the issue that you want to address, you look at the key players, you look at the specific members of the public who are going to be most affected by it, and you get them into a room together, usually over a number of spaced out sessions. And together they create a shared understanding from their different perspectives of what the problems are and a shared set of solutions for how to address them. And often they go on and implement them together as well. Co-creation is a really tried and tested method. In the UK, it's most often been used in health settings, but it's got a real applicability to climate change. So if you think, for example, if you imagine having created the first iteration of the Green Homes grant, or whatever the first iteration was called, like that, you'd have ended up with a much better process. And there are lots of examples of policies within the climate world which could benefit from an approach like that. The third method that I just wanted to briefly touch on was legislative theatre. So I really ummed and ahed about whether this was the right third method, because there are a huge range of what are known as participatory methods. So if you think participatory budgeting, you think online crowdsourcing, you think Brazil's national policy committees, which I suspect, they're not very well known outside Brazil, but they are fascinating if you've ever want to take a look at them. But in the end, I hit on legislative theatre because it's one example of a method that focuses on developing solutions to policy challenges centred around particular shared experiences. So, for example, it's been used in the UK for developing policies around public transport and active travel, looking at barriers that disabled people face to accessing them, looking at barriers that women and girls, trans communities and non-binary communities face to accessing them because of the harassment that they face. I haven't got time to describe how it works, but it's an example of a method that's really successful in equalising power dynamics in a room, where you really get officials and politicians and people from the communities working together on a level playing field to really understand each other's perspectives and to work together to create solutions, and also to test them in real time, which I think is one of the interesting things about it. And certainly, whether it's legislative theatre or one of the other methods that works well for different groups, engagement that really focuses on the communities that are going to be most affected by the transition are going to be a really important part of developing successful national policy in this area. And I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I open up kind of to questions from the floor, Minister, you were going to ask some questions of the panel, just to see if you want to dig into anything.
Yeah, I'll just throw out a few quick things. I mean, one of the things that was occurring to me as you were all speaking is, we know that putting things in a sort of place-based context really is a way to connect with people, particularly with things like nature but the just transition. If you can say to people, we'll give an example. I was with the Metro Mayor from Merseyside, Steve Rotherham, a couple of weeks ago, and what they're doing, transforming, Liverpool. They're just doing so much up there, but all of this groups together to a whole story about what Liverpool will look like years in the future, and there are other areas where it's particularly, along the North Sea, where it's that transition away from fossil fuels to the industries, whether it's offshore wind, carbon capture and storage, all those things. And nature, I think, particularly people's love of nature very much begins in their own gardens, their own parks, and, what they get to experience. And I just wondered how, when you're doing these broader exercises, all of you are reaching out to nationwide audiences, bringing all sorts of people together. How do you capture that side of things, the power of that sort of place-based approach in what you do?
It's a great question. And I think part of what we need to do is listen to and learn from some of those great place-based examples. But I think what they also tell us is that people like feeling part of something and part of that story and part of the story of a place. And I do wonder if part of what we're missing from the national story is that story at a national level. Like, what is our version of that story about the country we want Britain to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? How can you learn from the brilliant stuff that is happening in those places and the connections that people feel, and tell that kind of national level story? And I think something that we hear quite a lot is people saying, like, I do my bit. I feel like I do my bit, but what is it part of? So I do think there is an important bit of capturing and elevating the brilliant place-based stories. But also, how do we turn that into a national story where everyone's going, I'm doing my bit, I can see where I fit in, I can see how this is part of something bigger. Because I think at the moment we have thousands and thousands of brilliant little climate stories, and we don't have a big national climate story. And I'd love something for the public participation strategy to help inspire is that bit of a kind of national story.
And that is something we've been very much looking at, how you can make people, some of it you want the change to be so easy, people don't even notice they're making it. But if you just do everything by stealth, then you've lost that opportunity to really win hearts and minds. So we want to have that national narrative that people feel part of something, but it will be based on their own sort of personal experience. And I think what you were saying about hope is just so important. And I think it was really good what you were saying about weaving the content into television programs, but they were positive messages. And I think particularly with young people, the problem is the conversation about climate change is all about the extreme climate, the weather events and disaster, and we are doomed, and it's negative. And I've said this to young activists before, yes, it's good to sort of call out the fossil fuel companies for what they're doing, but actually it'd be really good if you could be proactively calling for onshore wind and solar panels, especially in places where there's some opposition to it, because that is the future story.
Yeah, I'm so pleased I'm an optimist, because I think I just don't think I'd go to work otherwise in the job I do. It's really important, and I think it gives somebody to focus on, some things to focus on, or people to focus on. The thing I was going to say was there's a lot of connecting the dots that we sort of have to do at BAFTA Albert, and I think probably across the industry, where there's lots of pockets of the projects or ways of working that just aren't connected, and people are working in silos. So a big part of the work that we do is convening and collaborating. We're almost sort of Switzerland, as it were, Albert, and we bring together all of these organizations that typically would never sit around a boardroom together to talk about policy and change, especially when they're competitors. So we have sort of a big responsibility there, but I think that's sort of connecting the dots. And I was on a call just before this one in that little room over there, which was great. And we were talking about how the music industry and the theatre industry and the TV and film industry, how we can become actually even better connected, because we talk to the same people. We're doing all of the same things, but we're sort of doing it in silo. So I think that's the sort of next turn of the evolution, or next turn of the wheel.
I'm really pleased you asked that question. Actually, when I was preparing for this panel and I was thinking about what engagement methods to talk about, one of the things that really struck me is that in the UK and globally, some of the most interesting innovations and impactful engagement work happens at a local level, not at a national one. And that's partly because it's place-based, partly because of people's connections with their communities. I mean, if you look at things like the Climate Assembly UK, it was local engagement. Well, it was actually also information. People in citizens' assemblies always ask that other people could have the information that they've had access to. But beyond that, it's local engagement that people emphasise as being really important. So part of the answer to your question is, I think that there's a question about how the national strategy facilitates and empowers local government and other local actors to do that, to have that space and have the ability to do that local engagement, because I think it's uniquely important. That doesn't mean that national engagement isn't important, because obviously national government makes an awful lot of decisions, and public input into that is needed too. You have choices about how you do it. One of the things about something like Climate Assembly UK is almost the point of it is that it's bringing together people from those very different places and getting people to understand the different contexts of those places, and then looking at where they can reach common agreement from them. So almost the point is it isn't quite so place-based anymore. But there are also other ways of running national engagement where you run kind of go to different areas and see the opinions in those different areas and then bring people from those groups together. So there's ways of introducing it, but I think more for my sort of public engagement, the point is that local engagement is really important too.
Yeah, cool.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the floor now. If you've got a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to ask you to please say your name, say your organisation that you're from. Keep your question nice and brief, please no grandstanding. I know you've got amazing things to say and loads of experience. If you keep it quite question focused, that would be really helpful, because we want to hear from as many people as possible. And also my colleague here is going to keep an eye on questions from online, because we might have some from outside the room as well. So anybody have a question? I can see some hands. Fabulous. Okay. Really short, can't actually see anymore. Yes, gentleman at the back, lady there, and was there a question over here? Sir. Do you want
Thank you for those wonderful presentations. Lots of really very valuable insights into engagement, but a key issue that's come through in work that we've been doing with the NPC, the Race Equality Foundation, is the issue of trust. Trust seems to be fundamental in deciding whether you bother to participate, but then also whether you actually do something as a result of that participation. And I wonder if the panel could just say a little bit about how do we ensure that people trust the process, get involved, and then actually take action as a result of that.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Fiona from Ofgem. Oh, yeah, sure. Try not to kick over water. Thank you so much as well. What do you think the role of the energy regulator is in all of this, trying to convince people to switch from radio, tele-switch to smart meters with sort of that lack of engagement? We've got Lorraine Kelly on board, but yeah, it would be great to kind of understand what you think the regulator's role in this and DESNZ as well, and how we can support.
Hi, I'm Nigel Richardson from an organisation called NAPIT. We accredit and train electricians who are an upskill installers. So they're increasingly installing heat pumps, solar panels, EV chargers, etc. We try and promote the economic benefits to them of upskilling into those areas. But my question to the panel is, how would you go about tackling issues around the myths, misinformation, misunderstanding of particular technologies, particularly as it starts to affect how people drive, heat their homes, go about their daily lives? So the changes that are coming are a bit more harder than changing the bus you get on, or you know, the electricity that comes in is now powered by renewables rather than coal or gas.
Thank you. So we've got three questions. One about trust, one about the role of the energy regulator, and one about how do we tackle the misinformation about some of these new technologies. I wonder, do you want to speak to the question of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I might roll them all in together in a way, because there is a real issue. I mean, particularly on things like heat pumps. And I say this as an MP. As was said, I've been an MP quite a long time, and there is such a legacy of mismanaged schemes. You know, the warmer homes, green grants. And I dealt with a lot of casework on behalf of constituents where it's quite notorious in Bristol. They call them the Geordie builders because they all came down from the northeast. And either like the work wasn't done to standard, or people were suddenly being asked to put thousands of pounds of their own money into it, or it was left half finished and that. And people have long memories, and particularly when you're going into people's homes, you're invading their homes and trying to get them to do something that's pretty disruptive. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And one of the reasons, you know, we're running this Warm and Fuzzy Warm Homes campaign to try to get that across. And this is why just things like having, you know, a heat pump in Emmerdale or whatever it is that sort of thing is important. And I think that goes into that sort of broader narrative that and why we're talking about having trusted messengers for this. So it isn't always about politicians who, you know, aren't the most respected and trusted people sometimes. So Octopus Energy have got to deal with Arsenal Football Club, and they're talking about heat pumps when people go to a football game. So it is reaching out, and different audiences will have different people they trust, and that's what we've got to sort of try and work on. And again, you know, so the myths and the energy regulator, again, smart meters, some people have had bad experiences, or they feel that it's quite invasive. But certainly we've got Chris Stark running the Clean Power by 2030 mission. He used to be head of the Committee on Climate Change, but his job every day is to look at all the different levers that we need to pull to make sure that we can proceed as quickly as possible. Yeah, I think.
I think there's a really important thread kind of running through the questions, which is I think about who are our messengers around a lot of this, and how are we helping them feel that they can kind of have those conversations confidently. So to your point, Sarah, I think like electricians can be really trusted in people's homes. You know, I did a lot of work with social housing residents in my previous role, and basically they would say the person I'm going to trust to talk to me about a heat pump is the guy who services my gas boiler, because I trust that he knows about heating. And, you know, if your housing officer comes and knocks on my door, I don't trust them in the same way. So actually, how are we thinking a bit more creatively about the people who are trusted to talk about different areas? And then what can we do? What can, the climate communicators of this world do with electricians or technicians to help them feel confident in having some of those conversations? And I think to the point about trust, we did a lot of research on this last year, like trying to think about, who is trusted to talk about climate, who isn't, but also what are the kind of key components that you need to think about. And actually what people look for, anybody kind of talking about climate, is, do you have some empathy with me? Do you kind of understand me and my life? And do you have a bit of authenticity? So like, what is your reason for talking to me about this? If you're kind of a bit of a chancer, or I think you're kind of selling me something, whether that's you're selling me an ideal or you're selling me a product, I'm not going to trust you. But if I feel like on some level you get me and you get my life, then I'm willing to trust you to have a conversation about this element of change or about the kind of climate crisis. So I think it's about understanding those components and then thinking a bit creatively about how we can support the people who are trusted for different people in different bits of their lives.
Thanks very much. Yeah, trust, regulation, misinformation, coming into the world of climate and sustainability from sort of a TV production background, the whole thing was terrifying. I barely got my head around net zero. And one of the things I think, that we do at BAFTA Albert is to try to demystify some of that language, and also be the trusting voice that, organizations can look us up, can call us, can talk to us, and we can give them the advice that is the advice at the time. But the other thing that happens with climate is that things change so quickly. So, phrases that are in are suddenly out. Offsetting is a good word one week, it's a bad word the next. It's really, really hard to keep up. And so we've got a responsibility, as I said, as Albert, to make sure that we give our members the best advice. And when it comes to sort of, I suppose, on air, and presenters, you mentioned Lorraine Kelly, great advocate for so many things. Some these people are in people's living rooms. These presenters are in their living rooms, and they're communicating with them every day. We've got a duty, I suppose, to make sure that those production teams are getting the right information to give to people like Lorraine, to make sure they're passing on the right information.
Thank you. To the point on trust and how you ensure trust and how you get people to take part in the first place, I think people have very different levels of trust in the political system, in government, engagement process that might be being run, and therefore different techniques are needed, and different kind of engagement processes in fact are needed. So in some cases an invite through the door with a council logo or government logo will be sufficient. In other cases that's actively off-putting. In those cases you can work with groups and people who are already trusted by the communities that you're trying to reach, and sometimes them talking to the people that they're working with them and encouraging them to take part is sufficient to get people to take part. Sometimes it's not, or sometimes just the fact that people aren't going to trust the space they're going into is a real barrier for people. And in those cases, you have a number of options. So one is to ask the groups and pay the groups to run the engagement themselves, so that they're working with people themselves in spaces that are already trusted by them. A slight lesser alternative of that potentially is to go to the groups, to speak to the groups directly in a space where they're already comfortable. But I would prefer to pay groups to run the engagement themselves, having told them what they wanted to find out. And that also allows them to tailor how they run the engagement to the people that they're working with as well.
Thank you. I think the only thing I'd add to that is that I think trust is a real slow burn of an issue. It's like, it's not going to happen overnight. Doing one really great engagement process is not going to suddenly make everyone turn around and trust the politician that ran it. There's way too much history there. So it's about building this slowly and showing over and over and over again, like a drumbeat through every single thing that is done, that you are talking to people, you are communicating, you are listening. And when people tell you stuff, that is actually then going to have an effect on the decisions that you make, and then telling people that what they said had an impact on the decision that you made. So it's something that has to grow, but you have to keep on doing it because there's a whole load of distrust. There's generations of distrust that people have been kind of growing and growing all this time. So I think that's something we all have to work on. And with that, we've got time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. And I'm just going to, have we got one online? Okay, we've got one online, fantastic. Lady here in the white, lady there in the black, and gentleman here at the front. In fact, that was 4 questions, so keep them really brief.
I'll do my very best. Thank you all. My name is Canning. I'm with an organization called ISWE. We're, along with the backing of a couple governments, including Brazil, running a global citizens assembly that'll be docked to COP30 and hopefully will persist afterwards. Part of that assembly is doing exactly what you said, Minister, taking place-based stories and making them global through what we're calling community assemblies that will, allow for anyone across the world to hold a community assembly and have their story be told, and then transmitted to COP. If my accent hasn't already given me away, I'm not from here originally. So my question is, I would love all of your thoughts on how the UK can lead in platforming and encouraging place-based stories on a global scale. My country has left a gaping hole where it could have been the leader, and I'm very curious for all of your thoughts on how the UK can capitalize on place-based, rooted, grounded climate stories to become a global leader.
Thank you, Danny from Greenpeace. In people participating, what is the perceived balance between like communicating to people to do a thing versus participating in decision making versus taking down barriers to people actually doing it? Does this strategy have any money? And what do you want the role of NGOs to be? Of NGOs.
Hi, yes. My name's Dave Cohen. I'm from the Haringey Climate Forum. I particularly want to address the point you made of thousands of little actions are taking place all around the country, but there isn't one big narrative. I was thinking from the government's point of view, I wanted to know how you were working to sort of build a single narrative and how well you're connecting with all the other groups, and is there an actual timeline for this for this sort of national conversation, and can we all link up with it? This is something that very much applies where I work. I work with local communities in Haringey. They work with the Haringey Council. They also work with the GLA, and the GLA work with the government. But it doesn't seem like there's anyone is talking to anyone. They all seem to be working in parallel.
So there's been one more question. But they're sort of a similar question, which is basically how can we best show what the benefits for people will be in their lives of the move to net zero, not just the costs, kind of going off what was talked a bit about before, particularly for those facing poverty and inequality.
Thank you. Again, it felt like all those questions kind of linked together really nicely around kind of an overarching theme, telling a story, having a single narrative. How do we show the benefits? So, who wants to take
Somebody else want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. Yeah. So thinking about sort of place-based climate stories, and so I suppose the work that we're doing with our membership, which are US based as well as UK based, are absolutely coming up with great ideas, great writing, and delivering on that. So I mentioned a couple. I mentioned Toxic Town earlier. There's a number of different projects that are in development, and those place-based stories, are coming from the States, right? But they may be shot in the UK. So there's this global community, which is incredible, and it's great to see. I think the other thing, sort of the benefits. which sort of wanted to sort of point to your question really, was there are sort of so many benefits around some of the work we're doing, especially in decarbonising the film and TV industry, reducing the need for diesel generators on set, which are they're always pumping away, churning out fumes, and transitioning to fuel free. And the aim for us as an industry is ideally by 2030, and almost in line with the UK power grid. So we're trying to do a number of things all simultaneously, and some things we're getting right, and some things we're bumping along at, and some things just aren't connected at all. And I think that's where I think it's really great that we can lean into other industries and learn from mistakes, and vice versa. I hope that answers some of those questions anyway.
Have a go at the question on barriers versus do this versus participating in decision making, which I think is to say that for the sort of engagement I do, I think about it more like, every project has a sort of little bit, or should have, often doesn't have, a bit of an evaluation budget and have a project management budget. There's a bit of public participation in decision making that will help most projects run better, but it's not the project as a whole. And if the barriers are already known and the best ways to address them are already known, then get rid of the barriers and don't carry on running participation on the same issue. I also just wanted to make a reflection, because the point of the work that I do is obviously to influence the decision. But we also see pretty profound impacts on the people who take part. And I think that's because instead of being told what to do, they're being asked to think about what they should do. And it's perhaps a subtle distinction, but people go and change their careers, change their jobs, start new businesses, stand for elected office, as well as making the kind of changes to how they heat their homes, buy electric cars. The changes are really quite profound, off really not a lot of time with people. So I think, just thought it's not directly the answer to your question, but I thought it was an observation that was related.
So I think it's, again, trying to answer your question. I think one of the other bits for me that the strategy needs to try and do is to think about how we engage people in the implementation of policy, because I think there's a big important part about the kind of design of policy, but actually what we need to do in the next kind of decade arguably is a lot around implementation. So actually having conversations, giving people more information, listening to people about what the kind of implementation of policy means for you, for your workplace, for your community. And I think we need to think as much about that as we do about the kind of policy kind of design. To the question about the Global Citizens Assembly, which is, I think, a brilliant initiative, and I think having those kind of local community assemblies and thinking how they ladder up to something global and hopefully can help shape a bit more of a positive story around something like the COP is really inspiring. I mean, I think what I hear a lot is Britain has been and has the potential to be a kind of leader on climate, and it's been great to hear you, Minister McCarthy, and to hear the Secretary of State talk about that. And I think we have so much soft power around that, and I think a kind of UK delegation going to COP and talking really positively and passionately about a public engagement strategy and about the work of Liverpool City Council and about the work of local communities can be really powerful and can really sort of lead by example. And just on the kind of point about kind of particularly kind of policy and how it works for people, especially people kind of experiencing poverty, I think this is absolutely essential. And, fairness is a term that means different things to different people. But whenever you talk to people about climate, it's well, this has to be fair and it has to kind of feel fair to me. So I think there's just some huge things about policy design. I think there's some things about how, how does it feel if you're asking me to make a sacrifice, but I can see celebrities flying around in a private jet, or how does that feel in terms of some of the policy decisions that we're making? But actually, again, there are already some policy choices and some investments that are being made. The government's done a bunch of funding for councils and housing associations so that there are a bunch of social housing tenants with heat pumps. Let's hear more from them. Let's hear more already from the people who are kind of benefiting from this. Because, I think the positive stories are out there. It's how do we kind of amplify them?
Yeah, so I'll try and, again, wrap up all of these. I suppose if I just mention a few things that we are doing on engagement, and some of it is relaunching things the previous government did, but I'd say we're doing them in a far more effective, not just a tick box exercise way. So we've relaunched the Net Zero Council, but we've expanded the membership. So it's not just engagement with business. So we have the Climate Action Network on there, which is the umbrella organisation for a lot of the NGOs. We've got Jabir at the back. He's now joined us. We've got Bev, who's in the room, who's joined us. But and I think that's really important to have that broader. And it's doing. We meet quarterly, but it's doing so much work in working groups and just discussions between people. And there's a real sort of sense of rhythm to what's happening. We've set up the local Net Zero Delivery Group, which is engagement with councils, which again I think it had become a bit of a tick box exercise, but we've had our first meeting. The next meeting is going to be at the LGA, because we don't want it just to be us talking. We want to be able to bring in as many other councillors, council leaders, discussion. We're going to have the Warm Homes Plan as one of the agenda items there, because we think that's the one where you really, really need to have local involvement and people knowing what the government is trying to do to make that happen. With the NGOs, I was sort of met with everyone around about the time of COP, and that's just sort of prompted me that we probably need to get them in the room again to sort of start talking. I talk to people all sorts of things, you know, like at events and so on, and individual meetings, but need to get them in the room. And I think we've got London Climate Action Week coming up, so that is going to be really, really big this year, much bigger than in previous years. And it's going to be partly about the tech sector and finance and business and that, but a lot about the creative industries. There's some quite exciting things that is happening on the theatre front, for example. And I think that'll be a really good, although it's London based, it will be a chance for a real national conversation about what we're doing. And on the, you know, about the run up to COP30 and how we can sort of help deliver those place-based stories. I mean, just the very fact that it's being held in the Amazon in Belém, that is a story in itself. That's the narrative. That's why they're doing it there, because everyone knows about the threat to the Amazon. I think forests are really evocative with people. I was at a Congo Basin conference last week, talking to people from like Gabon and DRC and so on. And it's not just forests for them, it's the peatlands that mean that it is actually, you know, net it's sequestering more carbon than it's emitting. Small island states, again, I think it's. I was walking to work today and I walked past the IMO and they're discussing a shipping levy this week, but there were Pacific Islanders with like flowers in their hair that you tend to see at COP and so on, and you know they just have incredibly powerful stories to tell. I co-chair the Climate and Clean Air Coalition now with Brazil, and my counterpart there, he's looking to do a huge amount of work with mayors. I think he's bringing together thousands of mayors. And again, going back to, I think the cities, we signed up to CHAMP at COP last year, which is about engaging with subnational government, which for some reason the previous government didn't want to sign up to, but engaging with people in places where decisions are made. The final thing I'd say is we also, with our new NDC, for the first time, it's got a youth clause in there, which actually commits us to engage with young people. And I've met with some, it's a bit fragmented, and a lot of the young people have sort of slightly self-selected, and it's a bit, you know, how can you get beyond it just being university students that are engaged enough to make their way to COP? But we're very keen to sort of make sure that we're engaging with as broad a group of young people as possible. And my colleague Stephen Morgan, who leads on this in the Department of Education, I said we've had meetings in the last few weeks or so about how we can make sure there's genuine engagement on that front.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to draw this session to an end. You're all very, very welcome to stay for drinks, a bit of nibbles, some networking. There's a lot of people in the room. There's a lot of incredibly interesting people in the room. So I hope you have a really good time kind of speaking to each other and finding out a bit more about what everybody does. Before I thank the speakers, though, I just also want to thank Carnegie UK, who are supporting the Collaborative Democracy Network this year. It's supporting us to run these events. So thank you to them for their backing for this. But lastly, of course, a very, very big thank you to all of our speakers who have been fantastic in kind of sharing your knowledge, sharing your information, sharing what you're doing in government. And thank you to the audience for being here and sharing your questions. Thank you.
Quite a lot of ground. It's good. Yeah, it was,